Okay, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. There's a lot in that statement. Straightforward whenever you look at it. Because in ancient times, there were lords and they were overseers. Kind of like you'd say dukes and duchesses of certain counties, if you will. In America, we would say that they were governors, I guess you'd say. And so those are the more of the lords type of things, or individual cities would have their individual lords over them. Nowadays, looking at it, but back in olden times, a lord was an overseer over a group of people, and a king was the overseer of the whole people. But if you look back far enough and you go into the Sumerian times, there was a time they mentioned whenever kingship was lowered to earth. And there had been a long time before that, but before that they didn't have kingship lowered to earth. So it's kind of a strange story whenever you look at it too. It's where people were just kind of going loose and haphazard, but there were ancient stories that contained morals, kind of like Aesop's fables. And this was supposed to have been guidelines. You heard all these stories all the time. They would tell you it was a constant thing. Every night, all these stories are brought up over and over again. It gets to the point like kids nowadays, you're like, Dad, I heard about you being a football player in high school. You would keep saying these things over and over again. And they would stick. There was a tradition, an oral tradition that people had, and they would tell stories, and these stories imparted kind of what to do and what not to do, and don't do this and do that, and little parables like the parable of the two pots, and just all kinds of ones would add up to end up making a set of morals that people were supposed to live by. Of course, whenever you try to enforce this, it came across pretty lopsided sometimes, things like that, because how could you compare this to that? How could you compare this guy going through this great war and killing this king to me having accidentally killed this guy over here, or me maybe just getting in a fight and killing this guy over here? How could you equate that big story with this little story? And so that caused problems, it seemed. And then the idea was taken is that it's no different, that there is to be an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so they came up with these laws. And we see that form in the old codes and the old, at first there wasn't really necessarily a law, it was really a code. And all the way up through the Middle Ages, there was codes people lived by. There was a code of chivalry where certain things you would do and wouldn't do. It was aspects that you were to live by. And back in ancient Sumerian times, before the Bible really set up, I mean, you can look at Abraham came from Ur. And this was really great-grandchildren, supposedly, of Noah. Well, now that we've really dug up under Ur and all the Mesopotamian cities over there, we find out that they go back much, much farther than even Adam and Eve would have been alive if we do the chronologically, and even let people live 1,000 years. It goes back to about 7,000. And whereas the Bible says 4. 6 total, 7. So it goes back farther than that. And then, of course, we seem to not find any writing, and soon we'll find more that probably goes back deeper. But then it goes to the Harada civilization, where Enki had said that they started from before they came down and went back up, where his great home was that he used to ride the Stag of the Abzu up to. And so Hammurabi's code was something that really became, known and different. Hammurabi's code was really the new setting for kings. And it was an idea that they locked onto. You can see back then, if a king died, then they thought they had to come up with all new rules. What are your rules, king? And you'd have to start spouting them off. And of course, at some point here, people figured out most of the rules from Hammurabi were great. I may want to change one because certain things had happened that didn't make it to where that worked out to be a great rule, or I need to add to that rule. We do that to this day. We get amendments, to certain things because it doesn't clarify good enough, because there could be a situation where this is really unclear. And so to clarify each of those situations, you have little amendments onto them. And you have this all the way through even the Bible. The Bible has a set of rules that you get, whenever they're at Sinai, but then there's a later covenant that has a few more different rules, and it changes things. And it gives you an idea too, that things are happening and then rules are made for things that happened that became an issue. Just like we do now with the Supreme Court and things like that, that you can tell by the definition that are in certain rules that there must have been something that happened that was extremely just like this rule for them to have felt like they had to make a rule about it. And a lot of these later rules are clarifications too. I mean, they'll go to the point of saying, if you buy a donkey and he does this and this happens and then that happens, then you have to do this and that. But if this happens, then you do. So they come up with all these things on this donkey situation that must have happened, and it may be an occurrence that happens before. Perhaps it's happened once or twice or things like it. So we can refer to this idea, this King of Kings. Well, what I'm getting at in this whole thing, though, is that there became a change here after Hammurabi. See, God was there, but the laws were written by the kings, and you had to go under each king of each area, and they had slightly different laws from each other. The big change would be whenever you said that all these laws had came from God himself. And now there really wouldn't be that change every time you did a king. And even if you overthrew a government because of what was going on, that didn't change the laws that were there in the first place. And so they become static, as opposed to a free form floating on what kings thought at a certain time. And so it's a big thing and a big difference. Humanity doesn't even grasp that, as all the way through every culture, kings in England had different ideas and different laws from different things, and they didn't necessarily have to do with the Bible. They got a lot of their ideas out of it, and they got a lot of ideas and morals from that, just as well as they got morals from out of normal, philosophy, and how things should be done or not done, and parables, and really putting it all together. Mankind is a conglomerate where we put it all together. All the Aesop fables idea, all of the Hammurabi Codes ideas, all of the ideas that you would then impart not on a king that could pass away and could change, but an unchanging set of laws that would end up coming from your God. Well, did God come down and ever say these things? Well, they say he did to somebody, so that ends it. It kind of makes it to where, and the priest talked to this entity, this invisible sky god thing, and he'll tell them, and he passes it on. So there's a time whenever there's a priest rulership on certain people, and there's a time where there are priests and kings. And so you can also see that there's this back in ancient times of whether the priests get to try to rule what goes on because of God, or if the kings get to rule because of their kingship, and that they help control the God thing, or does the God thing control them? And the Bible was turned to take away from kings. They didn't like the Lord idea. They didn't like the overseer, and they sure don't, because of slavery and things that were going on then. They didn't like that idea. All these people talk about African American slavery, but really, and not African American, but 92% of those actually went to Spain, or to South America from Spain, Spaniards. Only like 4 to 6% went to America in the first place, or by the end of it. But so African slavery. But before that, there was these Sumerians, slaves on slaves. There are laws in the Hammurabi Codes that are literally dictated to that, and there are no black people involved there. And they talk about the black-haired people, which would be the people of the Levant and the Egyptians, because they all wore the fake black hair wigs. And there was this thing set up in the primordial time where they would do this and that. Well, Hammurabi was a king of the whole area, the four corners of the earth. You could go down into Egypt, up to here, up to there, all the way over here, and all the way down to the water. Water, water, up, into mountains, of course. But you know, they only talk about that, just like they only talk about in the Bible, those little four corner areas. They don't refer to deep Africa, and they don't refer to Chinese people. They don't refer to Eskimos and stuff and Aleutians that are up north and Russians and people that are still there from the Ice Age. They're only talking about this little area that they know everybody's real warring on, you know, a square that to this day is that square of conquest that everybody feels like they have to get. And at one time, whenever the continental ice shelves were down closer, this would have been a land of plenty, and in fact, go too far north or too far south, and there isn't. And so it would have been the only great area, right? But then as it separated away, it became better to be farther north and farther south. So you see some Egyptian going south. You see some Caucasoids going north. And then later you find the Egyptians leave and go north too as they ditch Egypt, because it all becomes a wasteland. And as it becomes a wasteland, people still to this day fight over a piece of land that, man, if it rained a few times, it might do something. But at this point, it's really not that great of a land to have. And the only thing that really holds people to wanting it at all is a holiness of something that happened 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. Sub me if you want. Like if you like the information. If you don't, I'm sorry. I always say that. But King of Kings and Lord of Lords, it has a lot in that statement. And it shows you a twist. It shows you a change of thoughts from ancient to a more modern. And then, of course, we can see our modern people don't do any of this. In fact, when's the last time Jewish people sacrificed goats and their firstborn children? None of this is really done anymore at all. It's all superficial, something we look back on and say, this is what helped get us here. And looking back on it repeatedly might help us to ascend and get better. But I think we're at that point where we've gotten past that, and we need to grab onto another rope and swing for that next vine. Yeah. Appreciate y'all.